Hi there everybody, my name's Alex Ford. I'm one of the three authors on this unit that we're sharing via SHP's Curriculum PATHS project. What story should we tell about Zitkala-Sa? Okay, so there were a number of reasons why we developed this unit. It was actually a really nice kind of matching up between some things that I was researching and things that Horsforth School were interested in doing at the same time. But it really came down to a few things, really. One for me was around how we taught Indigenous histories, particularly North American Indigenous histories in schools. Quite often that was done through the GCSE units, and having taught that and being part of writing books for that even, I didn't actually feel they were being done particularly well, and I was a big part of that problem with the stuff that I'd written and giving enough voice to Indigenous presence. So I was really keen to do something around that. I was also keen to do things with a local school, but actually as it turned out Horsforth School don't teach that particular GCSE unit, so we looked instead at maybe putting that into Key Stage 3, and we started from this point of view of actually lots of people really know a little bit maybe about 19th century, maybe previous Indigenous presence, Indigenous histories, but they don't really know an awful lot post 20th century or 20th century and beyond. So we kind of looked at that as kind of a big issue. And at that point as well, so there's some examples here, but at that point as well, I've been reading a book called Heartbeats of Wounded Knee by David Troyer, and that had looked at this issue again of the fact that lots of people's view of Indigenous presence was very outdated, and it was based on that The Brown book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which kind of implies not just the horrific things that happened to Indigenous peoples throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, and he does go a little bit into the 20th, but also that kind of the end of the 19th century was also the destruction of Indigenous presence altogether. And this idea that Troyer talks about, our cultures are not dead and our civilizations have not been destroyed, our present tense is evolving as rapidly and creatively as everybody else's. So this idea that the way we've been teaching these histories maybe have been really problematic. And that was a theme that was also picked up much later by this chapter in What is History Teaching Now by Layla Blackbird and Caroline Dodds-Pennock, which talks about the failure to teach Indigenous history as well is a form of violence that sustains a settler colonial present. So for me, these were kind of drivers behind creating a resource to help GCSEs teach this better, but more excitingly, it turned into a project to kind of put this into Key Stage 3 teaching. We also wanted to tie it in, of course, with the ethical principles. And so there's lots here that I think speaks to what we were trying to do. So that we wanted to train and prepare children to think critically and historically. This is definitely a historical significance unit. And it was very much designed to help children think about what does it mean to be significant? How can somebody be significant if, like the person who is the centre of our unit, they're pretty much forgotten by most of history and yet were really, really important. So that idea that it's provisional nature of significance. We wanted to show that there were really deep connections between the past, the present and the future in terms of Indigenous presence in North America, and that those issues were not done and gone, but actually ongoing and live. And that was one of the reasons we situated this not just in the 19th century, as a bit in the 19th century, but actually into the 20th as well. To enable children to understand themselves and others, we wanted them to really engage with what it meant to be Dakota at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and of course what it means now, because we wanted to connect that up with the present, and give children a chance to reflect on those things, and also give them a chance to respond to what they'd learned and heard, to challenge some of those silences in the past. And we very deliberately chose something that we thought was an underrepresented part of history. But we also thought it was something that was meaningful, and as you'll see with the end product that we get onto in a minute, we hopefully connected that up with giving them an opportunity to respond and be able to have an impact on these things. Yeah, so the outcome to this is something we thought very hard about. In fact, we spent quite a lot of time at the beginning of the discussions about what we wanted this unit to be. We knew it was going to be a Year 8 unit because that's where it fitted in the curriculum, just in that kind of turn of the 19th into the 20th century, preparing for Year 9. But we also knew we wanted this to be something that engaged with that issue of historical significance and did it in a way that was engaging and interesting for young people, and Year 8s especially, because that can be a really difficult thing to do. So in the end, we alighted on this use of, those the books that you get that are kind of 100 important people or 10 Great Britons that changed the world, or those sorts of things that always have a book full of key people and why they're so important. And we started actually the point of view of saying, well, why don't we get children to look at those kinds of books, work out who gets put in these things, and then introduce the person who's going to be the core of our unit, Zitkala-Sa, who was a Dakota activist in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, and who was incredibly powerful, important in her time, probably the preeminent activist, particularly Native American or Indigenous American activist of her day, but now is largely forgotten, doesn't appear in textbooks, doesn't really appear anywhere. So we wanted to take that as a core, and we said, well, why don't we get them to produce something? And so these are just some examples of people's work of getting them to write their own double-page spread that would fit into one of those books. And the idea is those get sent off to publishers and say, but why don't you include somebody like Zitkala-Sa in your work? So there's lots of work that we wanted to do around that. These are some examples just of where the pupils got to think quite hard about the story they wanted to tell, which bits of her life they wanted to include, what images they wanted to include they thought represented her life, either from things they'd seen in the lessons like the image on the right, or things they'd created themselves. I really love this one with the cutting of the hair, which again, if you teach this unit, you'll understand the significance of that. But we thought it really helped to kind of get them focused on a meaningful product that was targeted, not necessarily at their age group, but slightly younger children in Key Stage 2 who might want to find out about these things and what did they think was so important for them to know. Yeah, so the big question, how do we get them there? There was a lot of backwards and forwards, and one thing I will say about this unit is it didn't just come out like this. This wasn't the finished product. This is the result of 3 years of running this unit now and revising and changing it over time for various reasons and to get the focus where we wanted it to be. And obviously I've been a little bit involved with that, some of the teaching in the first year, but I've been less involved over the last couple of years. But this is kind of where Ross and the team and Chris have kind of shaped this unit and got it to by now. There are 7 lessons in this, and one of the reasons there are quite so many lessons is partly because the students don't necessarily have lots of context of American history at that point, so we need to do a little bit of background on that. And we have a whole lesson actually looking at what does it mean to be significant, where we both look at those books. We introduce Zitkala-Sa, look at her life and think a little bit about her as a person. And then we also need to know a little bit about who the Dakota are. So Zitkala-Sa was Ihontawan Dakota, and just for the pupils to really understand, what does that mean? What does it mean to be Dakota, to be Ihontawan, to sit within this broader label of Indigenous peoples when they may have very little understanding already. So we do quite a lot of work in those first 2 lessons, just getting them thinking about what do they know already about Indigenous peoples, what are their preconceptions, what are their stereotypes. Some of them have almost none because they've not even thought about it. Others have quite a lot from film, TV, video games, but lots and lots of things that we started to do to unpick that. And then basically doing tasks like these of introducing Zitkala-Sa as a person. So we use some of the portraits that she had taken by her friend Gertrude Kazabia, and we get them to look at those and what sort of person is this that we're looking at here? What kind of clues do we get from the images? And this very Victorian version of her, but also this other side to Zitkala-Sa in exactly the same period on the left, where she is kind of, on one hand, this 19th century, this kind of idea of the ideal 19th century Victorian, in inverted commas, woman, and then this opposite that she kind of portrays of this strong, independent, deeply rooted in her culture, Indigenous campaigner, activist, and certainly in the right-hand photo as an older woman. This was really fascinating because the pupils are always really taken aback by that gap, that kind of 25 year gap between those 2 photos and how much she changes, but also her confidence, her comfort in that space. So we look a lot at her, who she is, and then in the second lesson, really crucially, we spend some time thinking about who the Dakota are. So we say, okay, so Zitkala-Sa, this woman that we've met, she's Dakota. What does that mean? Who are the Dakota? And we do a lot of focus on that on language. So we get them practicing saying some of these words that are really important to the Dakota culture. So the Dakota themselves, the Ochechi Shakaway, who are the kind of broader group into which the Dakota sit. Oyate, which means the people. So that would be the Ihontawan specifically. And we really get them doing that whole class chanting kind of thing, getting them just comfortable with this language. And then we also get them to think about not what were the beliefs of the Dakota, which of course is important in terms of the 19th century when Zitkala-Sa is born, and in the early 20th century when she's an activist. But also, what are they now? So we kind of wanted to connect that up with this continuing presence idea, and so we used this brilliant resource from the Woy Lakota Project, which has a range of interviews of people just talking about what are Dakota beliefs, what are Lakota beliefs. And there's some lovely ones here from people like Stephanie Charging Eagle, where they talk about all these really crucial aspects to what does it mean to be Dakota, what are the core beliefs of most Dakota people. So that's the first two lessons, really kind of setting up who this person is, where they sit, who their people are. Lesson 3 then has to deal with this issue of settler colonialism, because for these children, they haven't really come across this before. So we talk about what that is, and we look in particular at how Indigenous peoples, in a broader sense, lands were taken via force, via treaty, via pseudo-treaty, as the US expanded, especially in this period. And we do that in a few ways. We start by connecting up with the present, saying this is a live issue right now, and we look at the pipeline protests that happened at Standing Rock, and there's a whole story about that in the resource. We look at some maps, and we look at, there's some brilliant maps by nativeland.ca, which looks at historical territories, and then it compares it to what's happened in terms of treaties, reorganisation, reservations, and so on and so forth. So we do lots of work with that. And then we also look at that history of how those lands were taken through the use of this winter count, which is Lone Dog winter count, which looks at the experience of one Dakota group through a period from about 1800 to 1870, and how settlers, colonists come in, there's initial trade, and then increasingly there's this kind of pushing off the land. And so we look at what's the impact, and how does that impact on those beliefs we looked at earlier. This is quite a complicated lesson. There's lots going on in here. Obviously, if you've done more context of this before, it's a bit easier, but we spend quite a long time on that, and just making sure they're really comfortable with this idea of how the Dakota more broadly were affected, but how the Ihontawan especially were affected up to 1870, and up to the point when Zitkala-Sa is born and comes into this world of colonists having taken most of the land from the Ihontawan reservation and then being sort of relegated to this very tiny pocket of land, despite the fact that actually the Ihontawan, unlike lots of other Dakota and Lakota peoples, were more open and actually did sign up to reservation quite a lot earlier, and therefore maybe expected to come out of it slightly better, maybe expected that they would be protected more, and ultimately weren't. So we'll look at that again. That's in the resource if you want to get access to that. Lessons 4 and 5 then start to look at Zitkala-Sa herself. So we've done a lot of preamble to this now, and we've done a lot of preparation. We've done a lot of working on pronunciations again with these things. We then look at 2 aspects that are really directly linked to the life of Zitkala-Sa. One, her early life, 1884 to 1900, where she is born, goes to boarding school, and her experiences of being assimilated through that boarding school system. And then in lesson 5, where we look at her activism after she leaves school and the kinds of things she does to challenge what she sees as the attempted destruction of her culture, her people, but actually more broadly she's concerned with Indigenous peoples in general. She's works on this kind of idea of we need to unite if we're going to challenge this. So in lesson 4 especially, we look at boarding schools, and we look at people's experiences of boarding schools, and we look at real stories of real people, and we use with caution some of these images that are provided by the boarding school archives, which show what they thought was the desired transformation, but what we see now in a very different light. And in particular, in that lesson, we use extracts from Zitkala-Sa's writing, get students to read them very closely, and think about the ways that they reveal this process in which settler colonialism was attempting, and settler colonists were attempting to, and the USA especially, were attempting to assimilate and remove culture. And we talk about that as an aspect of genocide. And we talk especially about the agency or lack of agency that children had, but also how they did try to resist in different ways and in small ways sometimes. We talk about this concept of survivance. So that's a big part of those lessons. And then we go on and we look at Zitkala-Sa's activism, which also I haven't included that here, but we talk a lot about the kinds of things she does. Here we go. To challenge and fight for change, and that includes her work as a teacher. It includes her work on something called the Sundance Opera. Includes her work directly exploring and investigating the conditions that were present in lots of reservations at that point and challenging the government, and her work in actually getting legislative change in government, but then also being a great critic of the lack of change that actually did occur after legislative change. So right into the 20th century, where she's really challenging and campaigning against the government, and how the government turned on her ultimately. And this is almost explains part of the reason she disappears from the historical record for many people. So during that, we get pupils to kind of chart and look at her changing influence over time and the kind of demand she's making. The final part then just looks at her legacy going forward. So what happened after her death? So she dies really sadly in 1938, and in quite dire circumstances. She hasn't got a lot of money. She is kind of being forgotten by the movement because she's almost, they see her as having bitten the hand that feeds, and so she's kind of pushed off and sidelined, and we get this kind of sad story at the end of her death, to the point where she's recorded on her husband's tombstone as just kind of the wife of. And so we talk about that, and the final bit then is to get students to think about, well, okay, we know all this now. What's been important in this, and what story do you want to tell? And the final part, therefore, is just to get students to put together their own stories that they're going to put into these books. And it's a lovely kind of celebration of all they've learned, but also something that I know from personal experience. I've got friends whose children have done this unit, who completely, without prompting, came up and said they've just been doing this great unit they really enjoyed. And it was lovely to know, because actually I hadn't told them that was something that we had done deliberately and hoped to do. So all of that stuff is shared. You can get access to that. We would love to know what you think of it. Any feedback you could offer would be brilliant. But do enjoy. There's some contact details on the SHP Curriculum PATHS sheet, so if you want to get in touch, please do. But yeah, let us know how you get on. Thanks so much.